Yeah.
So just welcome everybody. What time, by the way, are we, Joe? I think we're down for 11:30 to 12:30, didn't we?
Yeah, if that suits you, Michael. Yeah,
that's fine. I can
earlier.
That.
Yeah,
I can kind of stick to that time frame. So I'm conscious people have had a session ready on this. So I just caught the tail end there of John's presentation. I had a meeting beforehand, but I just caught the tail end of it, and he was giving good advice. I know John for many years. We used to play football with each other back the years. He was a good sportsman as well, and the same sort of advice he was giving you there, I could see that's how he also carried himself on the field of play. He never ever gave up. So very practical advice from a man who's been very successful in life. Okay, so my name is Michael Lang. From NUI Galway, the National University of Ireland, Galway. I'm based within the Business Information Systems discipline in the School of Business and Economics. My background is in business systems analysis and design. So, requirements analysis, database systems, programming, essentially gathering the requirements for business systems and then converting them into technological solutions. And for the past 10 years, then I've gone into the cybersecurity space. I'm coming from a background in systems analysis and design. That's always part of who I am and where I'm coming from. You always think about people and requirements and how technology is there to serve the needs of organizations. And you're always conscious of how technology isn't always the solution either, and often can create problems. So in the School of Business and Economics, the focus we have on cybersecurity is very much on the behavioral aspects of it. So things like organizational culture, national culture, processes and procedures, the psychology of how people think, and the human aspects of cybersecurity. Our colleagues in the School of Computer Science focus more on the technical aspects. We obviously focus on some of those too, because we have to understand them. But because we're on the social sciences end of things, it's more on the softer side, the people side of cybersecurity. We introduced a postgraduate certificate in cybersecurity for business last September, funded by Springboard. Hopefully that will be funded again this coming September. And we're very optimistic of that, waiting for the result of that to come from the HEI. And then commencing in September 23, we have a new MSc in cybersecurity risk management starting within our school as well. So today, what I'm going to be speaking to you about is the rogue insider threat. And this is based on the doctoral research of Sean Browne, completed in 2018. Now, whether you look at the academic literature or whether you look at the industry literature, they tell us about the rogue insider threat being a major one. So here are two quotes from two of the big hitters in the cybersecurity and criminology literature. So Vance and Sippinen. Persistent problem in information security is the threat of malicious insiders or members of an organization who are entrusted with access to information resources but abuse that trust. Willison, again, one of the key criminologists in this space, internal computer abuse represents a momentous threat for organizations. So it's well recognized for several years in the academic literature as a major problem. In the industry literature, you can, it just abounds in this, but here are just two quotes taken. Kroll 2020. It's estimated that incidents caused by insider threats account for 2/3 of those reported by organizations, and that Ernst & Young employees and criminal syndicates are seen as the greatest immediate threats. And for many organizations, the most obvious points of weakness will come from an employee who is careless or fails to heed cybersecurity guidelines. And in the past year, as we've moved to a work from home environment, and indeed, as many organizations are embracing that going forward, and legislation is pushing us in that direction, the risk of the rogue insider, I suppose, and the negligent insider working out of a home office is more than it was before. And in the past year, an awful lot of cybersecurity incidents have been because of employee issues from working from home. There have been several really high profiler insider breaches, just a few of them, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these in the media. Waymo back in 2015, that was Google's self-drive thing. They were lead engineer exploited 14,000 files, moved to a company. Uber took over that particular company, and essentially Uber had to hand over 245 million of shares in compensation for this exfiltration. Bupa, 500,000 records stolen from a CRM system, tried to sell them on the dark web. Company got hit with a huge fine for a data breach. Microsoft, okay, covered up in a day, but 250 million customer records exposed on the web. Similarly, ANU in Australia, a lot of personal data stolen. Both of those were negligent employees, and in a moment I'm going to talk about the difference between malicious and non-malicious behavior. So the first two were very deliberate, very malicious. The second, third and fourth cases here were non-malicious, but nevertheless resulted in breaches, and they were deliberate but non-malicious, in the sense that the employee deliberately didn't do something, which led then to the incident actually happening. GE in the USA, a lot of data again exfiltrated, and the motive, as is often the case, to set up a rival company. Again, this guy was sentenced to 7 years. Cisco, similar case. This employee was let go, but still had access, deployed the malware, and caused massive damage. 2 years in prison for that, and lots of other cases of Coca-Cola, the NHS, Boeing, and so on. So there've been several of these very high-profile insider breaches. This, then some statistics. Now you can find lots of different data on this, but they're all kind of, generally speaking, in kind of the same ballpark. 60% of data breaches were caused by insider threats. And then in the last year, this is 2020 data, 61% of companies who experienced an insider attack in the past year. You're seeing that general type of figure reported in several different industry reports. I often take industry reports with a pinch of salt because they are in the business of selling fear and in the business of selling solutions. But when you see consistency across several different reports in that kind of general ballpark, it's telling us, yes, this is the reality of things. And indeed, perhaps there may well be underreporting because of people not disclosing these insider issues because of GDPR and other losses that can result of it, reputational loss and so on. So the types of insider threats. So I want to make a distinction between the malicious insider. Now, this is somebody who knowingly and intentionally commits a breach for malicious reasons. And that very often might be financial gain. It might be revenge. It could be, revenge often for being let go, whatever it may be. Disgruntlement, they're not happy with a particular, decision that was made about them. They weren't promoted, or they weren't happy with being overlooked by somebody else. And these are quite deliberate and intentional malicious acts. Now, they are different from the non-malicious insider, which can often simply be called the negligent insider. And this is very often the ordinary employee who sometimes it might be inadvertently makes a careless mistake, or they knowingly break the rules, but not out of malice, or they knowingly break the rules, but they don't see any harm in it. Now, again, let's be clear, this is quite deliberate. The person's deliberately doing something or deliberately not doing something. What I mean by not doing something, they didn't, follow the particular procedure. They didn't install the particular anti-malware, whatever it was, but they were, for whatever reason, they were reckless, they were careless. But the difference is that they are not in it to gain themselves, or whatever gain they see. They don't see that gain as kind of hurting the organization. They don't see any harm in it, okay? So it's a different type of motive that drives the non-malicious insider. Now, again, the impact of these breaches. This is again a graphic from Delinea. 50% of organizations who had an insider attack suffered operational disruption. 48% of them saw the loss of critical data and intellectual property, and 37% experienced damage to their brand. So these are costly, and again, this is one of the reasons why perhaps they are being underreported and covered up because of the cost. So they cost you in several different ways. So financial risk, obviously the cost of the business interruption, and the cost of recovery costs. If it's a ransomware attack, you've got the ransomware, and you might have a share price fall as well. If it leaks, you can have litigation. You can have customers taking you for negligence, loss due to negligence, and vicarious liability is where the employer is deemed to be liable for the inappropriate actions of their employee. So they're deemed to be responsible for that. So, you have a rogue insider, the organization takes the hit. They're vicariously liable for that. You get very large regulatory fines. So, for example, British Airways were hit with a huge fine under GDPR for a breach, which was as a result of insider breaches, and of course reputational damage and loss of trust. So the downside of this is potentially very, very big. All the more reason to prevent it from happening. And indeed, sometimes this is why we don't get the true story of what gets out there. The PR speak up when you have a breaches. I'm sorry, we can't disclose any further information about this because it's currently being investigated by Interpol, which is true. But it's another way of just not quite telling the full story of what really unfolded internally. Now, what we're going to look at now is some academic theories in terms of why do insiders why do they act in these ways? And what is it that we could do to discourage them from acting in those ways? So I'm about to present to you shortly the findings of Sean Browne's doctoral thesis, and that was based on two strands of academic literature. First strand was rational choice theory, and rational choice theory comes from economics, and it's basically a theoretical explanation of why we make decisions. I mean, the rational actor, we weigh everything up, we look at all the eventualities, and then we make a rational decision based on an evaluation of the situation. And this rational choice theory came to prominence in criminology in the 1990s. Now, some people will say the difference between making a rational choice in how you conduct a legal act and a rational choice and how you conduct an illegal act aren't quite the same thing. But there's been quite a bit of work in criminology and the psychology of cybercrime based on this theory. So what it assumes is that rogue insiders will evaluate the perceived costs and benefits of their actions. Now, the perceived costs, so in terms of the actual costs and benefits, it's very difficult to perhaps objectively evaluate those, but the insider will make their evaluations, their perception. If I act in a certain way, what are the costs to me? What do I think will the costs to me be of doing this? What do I perceive will be the benefits? So when they weigh up the perceived costs against the perceived benefits, they may then decide, okay, am I going to pursue with this particular course of action, or will I not? No, it's not just those two that are at play. There are, of course, other things that are at play as well. You may well think, well, you know what, I may gain more from this in terms of perceived costs, perceived benefits than I'm likely to lose. But does that mean you're going to proceed and conduct an illegal act? It doesn't, because other things come into play, such as deterrence theory and, importantly, moral reasoning. So deterrence theory is all about the perceived certainty and the severity and the swiftness of the sanctions. So that's basically the costs. Okay, so if you kind of weighing things up, okay, I am definitely going to be caught here. It's going to be a severe penalty, and it's going to be doled out pretty quickly. That's going to, in theory at least, deter you. Now, when we take a look at the research, you might think that's the case, that the sanctions are a real deterrent. When we get to the findings, we're in for a bit of a surprise in that regard. Other things that come into play here are things like prior punishment experience. So if you have previously been sanctioned, or you know of others who have been sanctioned for inappropriate behavior, that is also likely to temper your behavior. What I mean by formal and informal sanctions, well, a formal sanction could be a reprimand, it might be a cut in wages, it could be losing your job, it could be a conviction. Whereas informal sanctions are maybe more to do with the acceptability of your behavior within the workplace, and it damages your relations with colleagues, and it damages how well regarded you are within your workplace. So they're the different types of sanctions. Impulsivity. Again, at the end of John's presentation, he was speaking about keeping ahead, keeping the cool, and not reacting and stopping and thinking about things. But the level of impulsivity and the level of self-control obviously can affect the likelihood that somebody is going to commit a particular breach. Their emotional state comes into play, and moral reasoning as well, in terms of what they perceive as being right and wrong, and morals are not objective. Morals are something that we are indoctrinated with, and they're very, very much based in culture, be that national culture or be that organizational culture. So certain organizations have got certain codes of conduct that are seen as that's a definite no, whereas other things that you might think, well, that's a bit iffy, but it seems to be accepted. That's what's called the social norms of the organization, and that affects the morals, and it affects people's perception of what is and is not acceptable. So these are all things that come into play. Okay, so the sanctions, formal and informal sanctions, the moral reasoning, the emotional state, and the prior punishment experience. In addition to, before we finish national choice here, we're going to talk maybe the costs and the benefits. So the costs of rogue behavior, there's your formal sanctions. So I said that's your reprimands, your fines, your loss of your job, your convictions. And the informal, or what's called the extra legal sanctions, so social disapproval or feelings of shame. So that's the downside of doing something. Whereas the benefits, now the literature is saying there's lots of different reasons why people might engage in this. Relief of frustration or impatience. So why would somebody circumvent a particular security control? Why would they, use Wi-Fi, insecure Wi-Fi when they should be using, secure connections? And it may very often be because of frustration and impatience, that the path of least resistance. Essentially, if you put too many barriers in an employee's way with security controls, the path of least resistance tells us they will circumvent that. They will find some other way around it to relieve the frustration and the impatience that's involved in that. Altruism, which kind of ties back to morals, that sometimes people may say, well, actually, they're going to do this for the greater good. For example, it might be whistleblowing. It might be to expose certain individuals that they feel should be exposed, and they see some greater good that, yes, I'm breaking rules, but I see a higher order of things here. Financial motives, very often for theft of resources that can be traded. Time, which ties back to relief, be it for saving time and the convenience of doing certain things. Career also tied into financial things. So, for example, stealing intellectual property to set up rival companies. The thrill, just the sheer excitement of breaking the rules and seeing could you hack the systems. Status amongst your work colleagues. Sometimes it might be more highly regarded depending on what you do, and then the esteem. So they're different. These are all different motives that can kind of kick in. And what rational choice theory basically tells us that the rogue insider will weigh these things up and make a decision. But as I say, it's also in the context of things like impulsivity and moral reasoning and prior punishment behavior. So that's your rational choice theory. In addition, there's a second strand of literature called neutralisation theory. And this is a sense how a rogue insider tries to explain away why they've done a certain thing, and explain it away that it's okay because. And there are different types of neutralisation theories that you can have. So denial of the victim, denial of responsibility, denial of injury, meta of the ledger, condemning the condemners, and appealing to higher loyalties. So let me briefly take you through each of those now in turn. What are we at? We're at 12:05. So denial of the victim, which is basically neutralizing things. What this is essentially saying is that they deserved it. They had it coming to them. They're cheaters, they're dishonest, they were unfair to us. It was retaliation, they forced their hand. So just simply denying that the person that you attacked or the person that was the victim of the insider breach, that they were a victim at all. And this can be further extended by dehumanizing the victim. And we often see this sometimes in politics and political debates, and you try to just dehumanize something completely. They don't deserve compassion, they're contemptible, they're uncivilized, they're worthless. And you just take the victim out of the equation altogether, and then well, what's wrong? I didn't do anything wrong because they're not a victim. Okay, and you try to rationalize it to yourself in that way. You neutralize it in that way. The denial of responsibility, another way of neutralizing it. Nothing I do is my fault. If anything bad happens, it's my fault. It's not my fault. It's fate. So they claim that the harmful behavior is due to circumstances or factors beyond their control, or they deny it altogether. So it wasn't my fault. I had no choice but to do it. It wasn't me. I was framed. I only did it because everybody else does it. What did you expect? The pressure and temptation was unavoidable. So completely saying that it wasn't their fault. And you can hide behind yourself on this one. I didn't know it was wrong. I had limited knowledge. I was in a bad mood. My intentions weren't malicious. The denial of injury. Okay, it's just an extension, I suppose, of the denial of the victim. You say, yeah, there's a victim, but you know what? They've got cyber insurance, so what harm about it? They can afford to pay. It won't really hurt them. I wasn't stealing, I was only borrowing. It's not piracy. I only made one copy. What harm is that? I was taking back what is rightfully mine. So denying that the victim actually suffered any injury at all. So that's your denial of responsibility. Now, the metaphor of the ledger is also part of neutralization theory. And essentially what goes on here is the idea of a ledger in bookkeeping, where you give a list of, I suppose, Santa's list, who's been naughty, who's been nice. And on balance, you might say you've been nice. So what happens is the person thinks, well, on balance over time, I've done a lot of good things, so I'm entitled to a bad thing every so often. You might say, I wasn't compensated for extra work, so I'm entitled to do this. Or like I've always followed the rules, or one little blip is okay. So it's almost you got your register, your debits and your credits of your good deeds and your bad deeds. And so long as you're in credit, which are good deeds, you might say to yourself, well, you know what, I'm okay on this. Okay, that's the idea of the metaphor of the ledger. That occasionally, every so often, you allow yourself to break a rule. Other neutralization theory things is condemning the condemners and appealing to higher loyalties. So I did it to expose corruption. I was only posing this because you're constantly watching me, or appealing to higher loyalties, which is going back to the altruism thing. I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do. I'm loyal to my principles. Your rules breach those principles, and protecting the rights and liberties of those who I care about. Now, this is actually interesting because when we start talking about ethical codes, and we start speaking about values and culture, you've got cultures. When we talk about security culture, it's multi-layered. It's like an onion. So you've got national culture. Okay, so being Irish, being British, being American, whatever it is, there are certain aspects of that nationality that defines who we are as a nationality, and that gives us certain values that we regard as acceptable in our society. You've got organizational culture. So you can have an organization with several different nationalities of people working within there. What trumps what then? Is it the actual national culture, or is it the organizational culture? You've got the person's own culture, which may come from their particular ethnicity or religion. There may be a particular discipline that has its own code of conduct. So you got this onion, and you got these layers in terms of what kind of trumps what. And occasionally you will have conflicts between a person's own code of honor and code of ethics and the code of ethics of the organization or of the unit within the organization. And if there's a conflict there, the employee might say, well, you know what, I feel I'm doing the right thing here. I know I'm breaking the rules. I know I'm breaking the code of conduct, but I actually feel that my own personal set of values, overrides all of that. So that's something we have to be conscious of, is this alignment between these layers of culture. Now, to take you back then to Sean Browne's doctoral thesis, the definition we adopted of an insider threat was a current or former employee, contractor, or other business partner who has or had authorized access to organization's network, system, or data. So when we're speaking about insiders, it isn't just in current employees. It can be former employees, if we saw there with the Cisco breach. It can be a third party in person, like a contractor that's also within the network as well. And that definition comes from the FBI and also the Department of Homeland Security. Now, how do you go about researching insider behavior and people's attitudes towards insider behavior? It's a difficult thing to do because you can't just send out a call for participation and say, hey, anybody out there who's ever done an insider threat, I'd like to talk to you. Doesn't work like that. And lots of these similar type of issues arise in kind of social studies when you're looking to speak to people that have engaged in deviant behavior. It's very difficult to recruit them. So what you do instead is use a technique called vignettes and scenarios, where you define a number of situations, and you then say to the respondent, okay, put yourselves into the shoes of the person in this scenario. Now, how do you feel about this? Would you have done this? Do you agree with this? And I think that technique has been used fairly widely in social sciences and generally tends to work reasonably well. Now, it's not, it is, as is often the case in cybersecurity, it's a form of simulation. It's a form of, doing things hypothetically. But most of us can relate to these typical types of scenarios. So in this study, there were 4 vignettes drawn up. 2 of them were for non-malicious insider behavior, things like using dodgy Wi-Fi, and 2 of them then for malicious internal behavior, such as stealing files. And then we came up with a survey of 1,193 professional contacts. They were based on the LinkedIn network of myself, Sean Browne, and the third co-author, Willie Golden. We ended up getting half of those. And they all completed a questionnaire then, where they read these vignettes, stepped into the shoes of the scenarios, and then were asked to respond how they would feel, or how they would identify, or how they would act in those particular situations. The responses, okay, were 67% male, 32% female. You can see the age groups spanned from 20-somethings up to 50-somethings. Mostly Ireland, but we had a few from the UK, US, and Australia, and a small number from other countries as well. And again, the sample spanned a number of different sectors, from the public, small SMEs, and large organizations. Now, without getting into too much detail on the methodology and all the statistics and blah, 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 and all that sort of deep academic stuff, the model that was used was as follows. So there's a whole bunch of hypotheses that were tested using factor analysis and structural equation modeling. On the right-hand side, we were looking essentially at intentional intentional information security rule violation. And we looked at examples of this with malicious behavior and non-malicious behavior. Now, these are both intentional forms of behavior, but the difference, to repeat again, malicious behavior is where the person that is the rogue is doing it to deliberately injure the organization and to gain themselves, whereas the non-malicious, they don't necessarily see any harm in it. Its intent is there, but they're doing it perhaps to circumvent certain procedures. And in the middle of the diagram, you have got costs, okay? And costs are made up of your formal sanctions and your extra legal, or also called the informal sanctions. So the intent to break the rules, we would suggest that's hypothesis 1 and 2 there. You'd imagine that that should be impacted by the perceived severity, uncertainty, and swiftness of your formal and your informal sanctions. Then you've got your benefits. Now, there were a whole bunch of benefits that we looked at early on in the literature, but when the statistical tests were run, they bunched a few of these together. So thrill and esteem and status all kind of bundled together into a thing called job fulfillment, okay? Career and time saving actually were dropped. They weren't statistically supported. Relief of frustration, that stayed in there. Altruism stayed in there as a motive, and then financial benefits as well. So these are the four key types of benefits that were observed in the statistical model. And again, the model is trying to hypothesize that these benefits should impact the intent to violate rules or not. And then over the left-hand side, your prior punishment experience, that should impact the perception of your cost, because if you or somebody you know has previously been sanctioned, you would imagine that should impact the perception of the severity of formal and informal. And then you also have these other factors coming into state, so denial of the victim. Okay, if you're denying the victim, for example, that will impact your perception of costs and benefits, the method of the ledger, the moral reasoning, whether you believe it's right or wrong, your emotional state, whether you were angry, whether you were calm, and the level of impulsivity. So these are what we call the pre-kinetic factors, to do with the if you like the state of mind of the insider, and that impacts their perception of costs and benefits, which in turn then impacts the intent to break the rules.
Sorry, Michael.
Yes.
Could I just ask a quick question? Why I'm interested in why time saving was dropped. I would have thought that was sort of a primary and obvious benefit to essentially shortcutting the intermediate security protocol.
Yeah, it's surprising. So basically, what you do in a technique called factor analysis is you come up with your set of items that you believe are relevant, and what you're looking at here is the final model that emerged. So in the initial model, it was hypothesized that time saving would be a benefit and that career would be a benefit. But then when you actually run the statistical tests, okay, the statistical test, when it runs the factors, it kind of tells you that something is deemed to be statistically significant or not, that there was enough weight in the findings to suggest that time saving was not just there by chance. And the statistical findings of this particular study didn't support that. Now, having said that, it's not that terribly far removed from relief. So relief from frustration and the time saving from the point of view of something that's inconvenient, those two aren't that terribly removed anyway. So relief was certainly held on there. I was surprised the time saving dropped, but that's the stats doing their thing. Now, in terms of statistics, I'm an interpretive researcher. I don't believe too heavily in statistical models. You always have to interpret them and try to make sense out of them. But in this particular case, the statistics didn't support time saving as being an issue. That might just be to do with this particular set of respondents.
I have a...
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Chris, yeah?
So when we're comparing sort of relief from time pressure...
Right. Well, I'm very low there now. Very low. Can barely hear that one.
Good to hear you, Chris.
Am I better now? No.
You're low, but I listen carefully now, Steve. So go ahead. I'll tune in.
Okay. Hopefully that's a bit better. The slider is still doing the silly way. It's moving on its own. Doesn't matter. The relief from time pressure versus sort of like saving time or however we want to talk about that. I had an issue in my last job where a contractor was getting onto a server and adding in their own keys to the root user. They had been given permission to make some edits, and so that they could get back on more quickly without the password, because we were giving them a limited account. They were creating a key so that they could just connect directly as root, but in a weird way, which was a massive concern for us, because now there was this key floating around that he was passing around amongst the other contractors.
Exactly.
Do we see that then as a relief from the frustration of us saying you can't log in directly as root, or is that a time-saving thing where he's now, I don't need to
Yeah,
Like, what do we class what action as which? Because then that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I would, to be honest, I see these two as being conflated, as you know, difficult to separate the two of them anyway. So while the statistical model kind of push time saving out, and it can, you know, sometimes when something gets dropped from a statistical model, it can simply be to do with the way it was set up. Okay, but me making sense out of all of this, I would see relief from frustration and the time saving aspect as being one of the same, really. And it's a common reason why people will circumvent controls. In this particular case that you mentioned, Chris, it wasn't malicious. It was non-malicious, but it's a very, very common reason why people will circumvent controls. Likewise, the career was dropped from this one, but again, that kind of can fall right back in terms of financial incentives. So, you know, career relates to, you know, people gaining in terms of intellectual property and so on. It may just have been that the particular respondents to the survey didn't relate to those particular questions, or they weren't relevant. But, you know, it's not that terribly far removed from financial rewards anyway. So those four categories that you kind of see there in front of you are kind of maybe condensed. I think relief and time saving could go together. I think financial and career could go together. Job fulfillment, what happened there was the thrill of doing something, the status amongst colleagues and your own self-esteem, they all loaded onto one factor, and then that was simply labeled as job fulfillment and these benefits. So look, there were 44 hypotheses, and it's a complicated model, and then you kind of work your way through it, and you kind of pick out some of the more juicy bits. And some of this makes perfect sense, and other things you might say, what's that about? But I'll give you some of the more headline findings, and then we'll talk about the implications of those. So we're 1224, okay?
Sorry, Michael. Yeah. The H on the X, what do they meaning?
Oh, sorry, they mean hypotheses, okay? So you will hypothesize that something will have a positive or a negative correlation, okay? So, for example, if you perceive that the costs, okay, are going to be high, you would imagine that that's what's called a negative correlation. So if you perceive high cost of a particular action, you'd imagine that the intent will be low. So it goes in opposite directions. That's what's called a negative correlation. Whereas a positive correlation is when they go in the same direction. If something is high, that the other thing is also high. So, for example, benefits. If you imagine that the benefits are going to be high to you, you would imagine that that will actually increase the intent to break the rules. So that's a positive correlation, okay, as opposed to a negative correlation. So H stands for the hypothesis, and that's always to do with whether it increases something or decreases something or reduces it and so on. And that's called the direction, which is positive or negative. So the main hypotheses that were accepted, so prior punishment, some of these are as you would expect. Prior punishment experience will increase the perceived effect of informal sanctions. So yeah, look, if you know somebody that's been through this before, or you've been through it yourself, that prior experience will mean that your perceived effect of the sanctions is higher. Okay. The denial of the victim will reduce the perceived effect of informal sanctions. Now, what this means is that if you think that what you're doing isn't that, if you're neutralizing it and you are dumbing it down and saying this isn't really that wrong, then the perceived effect of the informal sanctions, which is how it's accepted within your workplace and the negative reaction from your work colleagues, you think, well, there isn't going to be that big of a negative reaction because, you know, if we perceive there's no victim here. And the denial of the victim can be very much tied into organizational culture and the norms of the organization. So if the organization and the people you work with are of this mind, it can then affect the effect of the informal sanctions. And informal sanctions often are more relevant than formal sanctions. Lots of research holds that up because it's the acceptability amongst your colleagues can often be more of a deterrent than the risk of your manager giving you a reprimand. The metaphor of the ledger, again, will reduce the perceived effect of formal and informal sanction. So again, if you think, oh, on balance, I've been good, okay, you might think, well, the likelihood then of me getting a severe reprimand here, or the likelihood of people coming down hard on me is lower. And that's really what that's again saying. So a person's perception of their own standing and how well they've done in the past affects the way they think about the potential fallout here for me in terms of formal and informal sanctions if I misbehave. Going back to John's point, at the very end of his presentation, he talked about keeping the cool, but impulsivity, which is basically people acting, quickly, not in a calm situation, just, not necessarily stopping to think about it. If you're an impulsive individual, again, that reduces the perceived effect of formal sanctions. You don't necessarily think about it that much. The formal sanction becomes less of a deterrent if you're impulsive, you just act, okay? The perceptions of job fulfillment. Okay, so somebody thinks, yeah, this is going to increase my status, it's going to increase my self-esteem, this is going to give me a thrill. If people think, yeah, this is this is going to be good fun, that actually leads to intentional rule violation. Okay, so this is something we've got to tackle. Likewise, frustration relief. Okay, if people think this is going to relieve frustration, if this is going to save time, and I'm lumping them together, that again we found tends to lead to intentional rule violation. The metaphor of the ledger has a positive effect on the frustration relief again. So again, this is going back to think about, have I been a good or bad boy, and this affects the amount of relief that you can get from it, and also on the thrill aspect as well. Denial of the victim. Okay, now that ties back to altruism. So again, if within the organization, the norms that are accepted, kind of letting somebody to neutralize their act, then they think this is more altruistic, what I'm doing here, because it's appealing to greater good and so on. You're downplaying the badness of what you've done and upplaying the kind of the goodness of it. Likewise, the denial of the victim has a positive effect on the acceptability of gaining financially. So again, if you're saying, well, and this goes back to also denial of injury. If you're neutralizing it, again, the fact that you're gaining financial from this isn't such a bad thing if you're downplaying the victim and the injury. Now, there were some hypotheses rejected. Interestingly, formal sanctions reduce the likelihood of intentional violation. That wasn't supported. This is the cost side of the equation now. Informal sanctions reduce the likelihood of intentional violation. That wasn't supported as well. So the hypothesis here are basically saying that if the person perceives the formal and the informal sanctions to be severe and quite likely and swift, if they perceive that there's going to be implications for them in terms of sanctions, that they're going to be less likely to break rules. But actually, we didn't find that. And that's not just in this particular research as well. So that may come as a bit of a surprise. But what it's telling us is that focusing on sanctions is not the way to go. The financial benefits from offending will lead to intentional rule violation. That wasn't supported of itself. But the reason why that might be the case is that yes, you might think, yeah, I can gain from this, but of course there are other factors at play, such as the moral reasoning and so on. So it's not just it's not a factor by itself in isolation. The model is taking lots of different things into consideration. So somebody just thinking, yes, I can financially gain from this, doesn't necessarily mean they are going to break rules, because there are other things to be considered. And likewise, perceptions of altruism. You might think, yeah, this is an altruistic thing to do. This is appealing to higher order of good. That isn't necessarily going to lead you to break the rule either. Now, comparing this with previous work, there's been a lot of previous studies in the space. But this one by these again, two of the big hitters in the area, Vance and Siponen, formal sanctions and an informal sanction. On the left-hand side, you can see the negative hypotheses that they would imagine that, you know, if these are deemed to be costly, that the intention to violate policy should fall, and that's what this model hypothesized. And then on the other side, they looked at the benefits. If you see, you know, high benefits in doing it, that should lead to higher intention to violate, and the moral beliefs again should temper it down. So similar to our study, H1 and H2 sanctions, the impact of sanctions on the intention to violate were rejected, but hypothesis 3 and 4, the effect of perceived benefits and the effect of moral beliefs, which also kicks into things like, say, your denial of the victim and your neutralization theory, they actually are of relevance. Okay, and I could give you a number of other studies as well, but consistently across a number of different studies, the sanctions are actually not found to be really an effective way of deterring somebody from violating policies. It's more on the benefit side of the equation that you need to focus. So the practical implications of all of this. What are we at for time? We're at 12:33. So efforts should be concentrated more on reducing the perception of benefits rather than possibly wasting time by focusing on the sanctions. Okay, so again, our study found that, previous studies have said that as well, the sanctions isn't really where you should be putting your efforts. It's more in the benefits of offending and looking at those, that side of the equation, and impacting the employee's perception of the benefits, and that can impact the likelihood of a breach. How do you do this? So you demonize apparent acts. So job fulfillment, which we found to be things like, say, the thrill of doing it, the perceived esteem and the perceived status that might flow on from doing this type of thing. You've got to tackle that. You've got to demonize it. You've got to make it unacceptable. And that's about tackling organizational culture, so that people do not see this as a benefit. The frustration relief and the time-saving aspect of it, that comes back to essentials of good UX design, enjoyable technology experiences. So far too often we see this trade-off between usability and security. And time again in the literature, we talk about, say, things like, say, technology acceptance model, which has got 3 basic dimensions: ease of use and perceived usefulness, and that then leads to the likelihood that somebody's going to use something. But if something is useful and easy to use, you're going to use it. If it's not, it isn't. So a lot of security controls are, getting in the way, poorly designed from a usability point of view, not particularly enjoyable, not fun, and we need to focus very much on this. Or what's going to happen is, as always is the case, people will find workarounds to reduce the frustration and the time-saving aspect of it. Impulsivity. Do we test for this? Because impulsive individuals, there are studies found that impulsive individuals tend to be those who are more likely to engage indirectly in breaches, because it affects the way they perceive the costs and benefits. So should we be testing for this? Again, many organizations often do in new hires and profile their personalities and so on. Of course, there's something we also have to coach people to keep the cool, as John would have said there in his presentation. So for existing employees, there's a way of maybe helping to avoid a Will Smith moment, do anger management class or whatever it is. But people that are impulsive, that is a risk. Okay. Organizational culture and values underpin so much of this in terms of the moral social norms and things like the denial of the victim and neutralization. So what is and is not acceptable within the organization is really, really important from the point of view of breaking rules, be they malicious or non-malicious. Ethical training again, and the impact of moral beliefs should be put into CETA programs. So additional information about this work. I mean, it's a very, very extensive thesis. I condensed it there into a few key findings. So it's difficult to do it justice in 20 minutes because it was 5 years work by Sean Browne. If you're more interested about it, you can contact me, michael.lang@nuigalway.ie. The entire dissertation is available on the ARAN research repository. So the insider threat, comparing malicious and non-malicious information security behaviors using a rational choice model. That's the link to it there. We can, the presentation is being recorded, but Joe, if you want to share that link on Slack, you can do.
Yeah,
at that point,
I'll do that.
say Gormagi and leave it open to questions. So we're a few minutes over time, but I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere. Happy to discuss the presentation and answer any questions you might want to put to me. So I'll just stop sharing at that point in time.
Yeah, that was great, Michael. Thank you very much. It's very, very interesting, the behavioral science aspect behind it all, isn't it?
Yeah, and we just dipped into it there, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's been a body of work on this in recent years, and when we talk about cybersecurity breaches, a lot of the time we speak about the technical aspects and ignore the human dimensions of it.
Yeah.
But of course, the humans can completely override and circumvent and break the technical controls. So it's really important to understand that aspect of it as well.
Yeah.
And there are other aspects of it as well that we could have looked at. So I mean,